The lights died first, a single flicker, then a hum that dropped into nothing, and the cabin fell into that particular kind of dark you only find 50 miles from the nearest town, where the dark isn't just an absence of light, but a presence all its own. I heard Rachel swear from across the room, that same laugh she always used to cover fear, low and quick, like she was daring the dark to notice her. The heater, which had been ticking and groaning for the last hour like it was fighting for its life, gave one last shudder and went silent. Just like that, 20 degrees outside became 20 degrees inside. I want you to understand something about Rachel Doyle before I tell you what happened next. She is not a woman who gets rattled. 20 years of friendship taught me that. I watched her talk down an angry client twice her size without raising her voice. I watched her drive through a blizzard to get to her father's hospital room without once mentioning she was scared. But standing there in that cabin, wrapped in a blanket that did nothing against a Montana night in January, she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. And it wasn't fear of the cold. "Mark," she said, and her voice had an edge to it, something brittle underneath the joke she was trying to make. "Please tell me you have a plan that doesn't involve us dying of hypothermia in a cabin that cost $400 a night." I didn't have a plan. I had a phone with no signal, a fireplace with wood too damp to catch, and one queen-sized bed that we had joked about that morning. The way old friends joke about things that feel impossible, the way you laugh at a landmine because you've convinced yourself it will never actually go off. She crossed the room without waiting for my answer. I heard the mattress creak as she sat down on the edge, and I could see her breath now, a small pale cloud in the moonlight, bleeding through the frosted window. She pulled the covers back on one side, looked at me, and I swear the whole cabin seemed to hold its breath along with me. "Just get in," she said. "I'm freezing." 4 words. That was all it took to undo 2 decades of careful lines, of best friend Rachel, of the version of us we had built so carefully that neither one of us ever had to look directly at what was underneath it. I stood there like an idiot, blanket in one hand. My heart beat suddenly louder than the wind clawing at the shutters outside. "Rachel, don't make this weird," she said. But her eyes weren't matching her tone at all. Her eyes were doing something else entirely, something that made my mouth go dry faster than the cold ever could. "It's just body heat. We shared a tent before. 10 years ago, on a camping trip with 6 other people crammed into 3 tents, when sharing space meant nothing because there was nothing yet to mean anything. This was different, and we both knew it, and neither of us said it out loud. I crossed the room. The floorboards were freezing under my socks. I lifted the blanket and slid in beside her, and the second our bodies met under those covers, I understood that this night was going to change something between us that no amount of daylight would ever be able to change back. But to explain how we got to that cabin, to that bed, to that moment, I have to take you back 3 days. To a phone call I almost didn't answer. 3 days earlier, my phone rang at 11 at night, which meant it was either an emergency or Rachel. With her, it was rarely a clean line between the two. "My name is Daniel Cole. I'm 42, divorced 2 years now, with a 9-year-old daughter who lives with me every other week, and a job selling commercial insurance that pays the bills and asks nothing of my soul. Rachel Voss has been my best friend since we were 22 years old, back when we both worked at the same failing bookstore, and bonded over the fact that neither of us could sell a single hardcover. 20 years of friendship. 2 marriages between us, hers and mine, both now over. Countless dinners, holidays, late-night phone calls about nothing and everything. She was 48, sharper than anyone I knew, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and rearrange the air in it without trying. When I picked up, she didn't say hello. She said, "I signed the papers today." Her voice was flat in a way I'd never heard from her before, like something had been sanded down to nothing. Rachel had been separated from her husband Mark for 8 months, but the actual divorce, the legal finality of it, hadn't landed until that afternoon. I sat up in bed and asked if she wanted me to come over. She said no. She said she wanted to disappear for a weekend, somewhere with no cell service and no history, somewhere Mark had never been and could never picture her. I thought about it for exactly 4 seconds before I said I knew a place. My uncle owned a cabin 2 hours north, tucked against a lake that froze solid by November, the kind of property that sat empty most of the year collecting dust and mouse droppings. I'd been there maybe 3 times in a decade. I told her I'd book it, and she laughed for the first time that night, a small broken sound, and said, "Only you would treat my divorce like a camping trip." I told her that was exactly the point. Sometimes the only cure for an ending is somewhere new to stand. What I didn't tell her, what I barely admitted to myself while I was arranging the dates with my uncle, was that some small, stubborn part of me had wanted an excuse like this for longer than I could comfortably trace back. There had been moments over the years, a hand lingering on my arm during a hug that went on 1 second too long, a look across a table at a wedding that neither of us mentioned afterward, that I had filed away under things not worth examining. Best friends did not examine those things. Best friends definitely did not examine them while one of them was freshly divorced and grieving. We packed in a rush, throwing bags into my car on a Thursday afternoon while my daughter was at her mother's for the week. Rachel showed up at my place in jeans and an old flannel jacket that used to belong to Mark, which struck me as either defiance or habit. I couldn't tell which. She tossed her bag in the trunk, looked at me over the roof of the car, and said, "Tell me this is a good idea." I told her it was the only idea I had. She got in the passenger seat, turned up the radio, and didn't bring up the divorce again for the entire drive, though I could feel it sitting in the car with us the whole way. Quiet and enormous, right up until the moment the cabin's porch light came into view through the trees and the first real cabin. Snow of the season started falling. The porch steps were slick with a thin layer of ice, and Rachel grabbed my arm to keep from sliding, her fingers digging into my jacket sleeve harder than the situation really called for. Neither of us mentioned it. I fumbled with the lockbox the rental company had emailed instructions for, my fingers too cold to remember the code on the first 2 tries, and Rachel stood behind me rubbing her hands together, saying something about how this was already a disaster, and we hadn't even gotten inside yet. The cabin smelled like cedar and dust when we finally pushed through the door. That particular smell of a place that's been closed up for weeks, waiting for someone to bring it back to life. Rachel flipped the light switch, and nothing happened for a full second before the overhead bulb sputtered on, dim and yellowish, casting long shadows across a great room that was smaller than the photos online had made it look. She laughed, this short, surprised sound, and said the pictures had clearly been taken with a very wide lens and a very generous imagination. We hauled the bags in while the wind picked up outside, rattling the windows in their frames, and I remember thinking the storm sounded angrier than the forecast had promised. Rachel took inventory of the kitchen like she was auditing it, opening cabinets, commenting on the mismatched mugs, holding up a cast-iron skillet with a satisfied little grunt like she'd found treasure. I built a fire in the stone hearth while she raided the pantry the previous renters had left behind, and at one point she tossed me a granola bar from across the room without warning, and my hand shot out and caught it an inch from my face, and she said, "Not bad for an old man." And I said something back about how 43 wasn't old, and she said, "Tell that to your knees when you were getting out of the car." It was easy, that back and forth, the same rhythm we'd had for 20 years, except somewhere underneath it there was this current I kept noticing and then pretending I hadn't, like when she leaned past me to grab a bag of coffee from the shelf above the stove, and her shoulder brushed mine, and neither of us moved away right when we probably should have. Like when she caught me watching her laugh at something on her phone, and instead of looking away like I normally would have, I just kept watching until she noticed and asked what, and I said nothing, and she held my eyes a beat too long before going back to her screen. We found the bedroom situation while she was scrolling through the booking confirmation, frowning at her phone screen, saying that the listing had clearly said 2 queen bedrooms. I checked the second door down the narrow hallway and found it wasn't a bedroom at all, just a cramped office space with a desk and a filing cabinet and a single window looking out at nothing but snow. Rachel came up behind me and looked over my shoulder into the room, and I heard her exhale slowly. "Well," she said, "that's not great." I told her maybe there was another bedroom we hadn't found yet, some hidden loft or converted space, and we spent the next 10 minutes checking closets and a narrow staircase that led only to a storage attic full of old furniture and cardboard boxes. By the time we came back down, both of us a little breathless from the cold air leaking through the attic vents, it was clear. 1 bed, 1 cabin, miles from anywhere, snow already stacking against the windows in soft white ridges, and just 1 bed waiting for 2 people who had spent 20 years being very, very careful never to need one. The temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared behind the ridge, faster than either of us expected. I remember checking my phone for a weather update and finding no bars at all, just a little exclamation mark mocking me from the corner of the screen. Rachel noticed the change before I did, actually. She pulled her sweater sleeves down over her hands and was rubbing her arms when she asked if I checked the thermostat lately. I had, 3 times in the last hour, in fact, watching the little digital number climb backward instead of forward, 68, 64, 59. Like something was actively working against us. I went to the utility closet where the unit lived, popped the panel off, and stared at wires and circuit boards I had absolutely no business touching. Rachel stood behind me holding the one working flashlight we'd found in a kitchen drawer, and every time she shifted her weight, the beam would swing across my hands like a searchlight. Nothing I did helped. I flipped the breaker twice. I checked the propane line. I even gave the whole unit an undignified smack on the side, which Rachel found hilarious despite the circumstances, laughing that quiet laugh she does when she's trying not to but can't help it. By 8 o'clock, we could see our breath inside the cabin. That was the moment practicality started elbowing politeness out of the room. We piled every blanket we could find onto the living room couch and tried sitting there together under a mountain of quilts, teeth chattering, pretending this was a perfectly normal solution. It lasted maybe 40 minutes before Rachel admitted her feet had gone completely numb, and I admitted my back was one more hour away from seizing up entirely on that cushionless frame. "This is stupid," she said, tugging the blanket tighter around her shoulders. We're 2 grown adults acting like teenagers avoiding a decision. I didn't answer right away. Outside, wind was throwing snow against the window in these long hissing gusts, and somewhere in the walls a pipe groaned like the whole cabin was complaining right alongside us. "There's one bed," I said, like she didn't already know. "I'm aware," she said. "I was there for the staircase, remember?" We both looked toward the bedroom doorway at the same time, then looked away from each other just as fast, which somehow felt more revealing than if we'd just kept staring. "We're adults," she said again, quieter this time, like she was convincing herself more than me. "It's just sleeping. It's cold. There's a bed. This isn't complicated." "Right," I said. "Not complicated at all." Neither of us moved. Finally, she stood up, dragging half the blankets with her, and walked toward the bedroom without waiting for permission or agreement, the kind of decisive move she used to make back when we were 25 and broke, splitting motel rooms on road trips because it was cheaper, back when sharing a bed meant nothing except saving $40. This felt different, and we both knew it, even if neither of us said so out loud. I heard the mattress creak under her weight, heard her exhale like she'd been holding her breath the whole walk there. "You coming? Or are you going to let pride freeze you to death out there?" she called, and there was something in her voice, some thin current of nerves underneath the joke, that told me this was the real negotiation, not blankets, not body heat, something neither of us had agreed to name yet, standing right there in the doorway of a bedroom neither of us fully wanted to enter alone. I crossed the room like a man walking toward a decision he'd already made, a long time ago, just never admitted out loud. The mattress dipped when I sat, and Rachel scooted over, giving me exactly 6 inches more than she needed to, like she was measuring something invisible between us. The blanket smelled like cedar, and the faint trace of her shampoo, lavender, the same brand she'd used for the 20 years I'd known her. Small detail. It hit me harder than it should have. "Get under," she said, lifting the comforter, and there it was, the line, the one that would replay in my head for the rest of my life. I didn't answer with words. I just did it, sliding in beside her, careful to keep my body angled away, spine rigid, like proximity was a test I could pass through sheer discipline. It didn't work. Within a minute, the cold had erased every ounce of that discipline, and our shoulders were touching, then our arms, and neither of us moved away. "This is stupid," she whispered, not meaning it as an insult. 2 grown adults scared of a bed. "I'm not scared," I said, which was the least true thing I'd said all week. She laughed, quiet and low, the kind of laugh that comes out when nothing else fits the moment. Then the laugh faded, and her voice dropped into something raw. "Can I tell you something I haven't told anyone?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see it in the dark. Some nights, before the divorce was even final, I used to lie in bed next to Mark and feel more alone than I do right now, lying next to you. Her voice cracked slightly on the word alone, like it cost her something to say it. Isn't that insane? 22 years married, and you're the first person I've felt safe enough to admit that to. I didn't know what to do with that kind of honesty. It landed in my chest like something breaking open. You're not insane, I said. You're just tired of performing for someone who stopped watching. She turned her head toward me on the pillow. I could feel her breath, warm against the cold air. When did you get so wise about marriages you never had? I had one, I reminded her. Softer than I meant to. Just not one that lasted. Do you ever think about why? She asked. Why it didn't work? The honest answer sat heavy in my throat. I think I built walls so well nobody could get close enough to leave. Then I got confused when she left anyway. Rachel went quiet for a moment, processing that. Or maybe processing me, the way she hadn't allowed herself to in 20 years. You build walls, she repeated. But you let me in tonight. You climbed in without asking, I said, and she laughed again. But this time it trembled at the edges. Would you have said no if I asked? The question hung there, dangerous, honest, unanswerable in the safe way either of us wanted. My hand found hers under the blanket, not fully intentional, more like gravity than choice. She didn't pull away, her fingers curled into mine, and for a long moment neither of us spoke, because speaking might have forced us to name whatever this was, and naming it felt like stepping off a ledge neither of us had checked the depth of. Cold? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Not anymore, she said, and moved an inch closer, closing the last of the distance that pride and friendship had spent 20 years building between us. I felt her breath change before I felt her lips, a small catch in her throat like she was crossing a border she'd been circling for 2 decades. When she finally kissed me, it wasn't rushed. It was slow, almost careful, the way you touch something you're afraid might dissolve if you're too eager. My hand found the curve of her jaw, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that I had touched that face 1,000 times before. Wiping away tears after her father's funeral, brushing snow off her cheek an hour earlier, but never like this, never like it belonged to me in some new and terrifying way. Tell me if I should stop, I said against her mouth, giving her the exit neither of us wanted her to take. Don't you dare, she whispered back. And that was the last coherent sentence either of us managed for a while. What happened between us in that bed wasn't frantic or clumsy the way I'd imagined forbidden things might be. It was patient, almost reverent, 2 people finally allowing themselves to stop performing the roles of just friends that we'd rehearsed so well for so long. Somewhere in the dark, Rachel laughed once, a small broken sound, and said, 20 years, Danny. 20 years I told myself I didn't want this. Same, I admitted, my forehead against hers. I used to leave your house early sometimes, not because I had anywhere to be, because staying felt dangerous. She went quiet at that, her fingers tracing absent patterns on my chest, and I understood that we'd both been protecting something fragile by pretending it didn't exist. Morning arrived without ceremony. Gray light bleeding through frost-covered windows. The heater still dead, but neither of us cold anymore. I woke first and lay there memorizing the unfamiliar sight of Rachel Ellison asleep beside me, her hair a wild tangle against the pillow, one arm thrown over my ribs like she'd claimed territory in her sleep. When her eyes opened, there was a flicker of panic before recognition softened it. Hi, she said carefully, like the word itself was fragile. Hi, I answered, matching her caution. We didn't move for a long moment, both of us aware that whatever we said next would either build a bridge or burn one. I should probably say something regretful right now, she finally offered, propping herself on one elbow. But I keep waiting for the guilt to show up. And it's not coming. Maybe it took one look at us and decided it wasn't welcome, I said. And she laughed for real this time, the sound loosening something tight in my chest. Still, the practical questions crowded in fast. Her divorce wasn't even finalized yet. My own scars from my marriage's collapse hadn't fully closed. We had a friendship that had survived job losses, funerals, and my daughter's entire childhood. A friendship neither of us could afford to gamble carelessly. We don't have to decide anything today, I said, watching relief cross her face. But I'm not going to pretend last night didn't happen. I don't want you to, she said, reaching for my hand under the blankets like it was the most natural thing in the world now. I just need time to figure out what we tell people, what we tell ourselves. Outside, the storm had finally broken, sunlight glinting off snow-heavy pines, and somewhere beneath the cabin's floorboards, I heard the heater sputter back to life, as if the universe had decided its job was done. Rachel noticed it too, glancing toward the vent, then back at me with something unreadable in her expression. "Guess we don't need to share body heat anymore," she said quietly. "Guess not," I agreed, neither of us moving an inch closer to getting up. Neither of us moved, and that stillness said more than the night before had. Then Rachel's phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking whatever fragile thing was forming between us. She reached for it without sitting up, squinting at the screen, and I watched her face change, just slightly, just enough for 20 years of friendship to notice. "It's Michael," she said. Her soon-to-be ex-husband. The name landed in the room like a drop. "You don't have to answer that," I said, though I already knew she would. Rachel had never been able to leave anything unfinished. Not arguments, not paperwork, not marriages that had been dead for a year before either of them admitted it out loud. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders, putting 3 feet of mattress between us in about 2 seconds. "He's asking about the house, whether I want the piano or the money from selling it." She let out a short laugh that had no humor in it. 8 years of lessons I never took, and now it's a bargaining chip. I watched her thumb hover over the screen, not typing, just hovering, and I understood she wasn't really thinking about the piano at all. "Rachel, I'm fine," she said too quickly. The same 2 words she'd been using since the divorce papers first arrived. The same 2 words that never once matched the look in her eyes. I got up and started the coffee maker on the small kitchenette counter, giving her space, giving myself space too, because whatever had almost happened under those blankets last night needed room to breathe, not the ghost of her marriage crowding into it uninvited. The heater hummed steadily now, filling the cabin with warmth we hadn't earned honestly, warmth that made the whole situation feel suddenly ordinary, almost domestic, which was its own kind of dangerous. She finally set the phone face down on the nightstand without answering. "I'll deal with it later," she said. And for the first time since we'd arrived, she sounded like she meant it. We ate breakfast in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable so much as loaded, like 2 people circling something neither wanted to name first. Afterward, she pulled on her boots and jacket, announcing she wanted to walk down to the frozen lake she'd spotted from the car window the night before, and I grabbed my coat before she'd even finished the sentence, unwilling to let her disappear into her own head alone. The lake was smaller than I expected, ringed with birch trees stripped bare by winter, ice thick enough to hold weight, but groaning faintly beneath our boots as we walked its edge. Rachel stopped near a fallen log, brushing snow off it before sitting down, and I lowered myself beside her, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. "Can I ask you something?" she said, staring out at the ice instead of at me. "Last night, was that just the cold talking, or was it real?" The question hit harder than any wind coming off that frozen water. I opened my mouth to answer, and that was when we heard it, a sharp crack echoing across the lake, followed by a splash, followed by a voice, high and panicked, calling for help from somewhere near the far shore. Rachel was on her feet before I was, already running toward the sound, and I followed her onto ice. I suddenly wasn't sure would hold either one of us. The man on the ice was named Pete Halloran, a retired mechanic who'd been checking a fishing hole too close to the inlet where the current ran warm beneath the surface. By the time we reached him, Rachel had already stripped off her scarf and was looping it toward his outstretched hand, shouting instructions I didn't know she had in her. "Stay flat, kick your legs, don't fight the water." We pulled him out shaking and blue-lipped, dragged him back across groaning ice that popped like gunfire under our boots, and got him into the truck with the heat cranked before either of us said a word about what almost happened to us. That night, wrapped in blankets by a fire we built ourselves this time, Rachel looked at me and said, "Maybe the universe just wasn't finished testing us yet." I didn't have an answer for that either. Some things you only understand looking backward. 3 weeks later, back in the world of grocery runs and school pickups, the cabin already felt like something we'd dreamed together. Rachel sold her house in February. "Too many ghosts in the hallway light," she said, and found a smaller place 4 streets from mine, close enough that her daughter could walk to visit on weekends when custody schedules lined up. We didn't rush toward labels. We didn't need to. Some evenings she'd show up with takeout and a bottle of wine, and we'd sit on my porch talking until the streetlights buzzed on. And it felt less like starting something new and more like finally admitting to something old. My daughter met her on a Tuesday, unceremoniously, over pancakes. She studied Rachel for a long moment, the way kids do when they're deciding whether an adult is trustworthy, then asked if she liked strawberries in her batter. Rachel said yes. That settled it, apparently. Kids know things before we do. There were harder days, too. A phone call from Rachel's ex that left her quiet for an hour. A night I nearly talked myself out of everything out of old fear. The kind that convinces you safety is better than happiness. But we kept choosing each other in the small ways that matter more than grand gestures. A text in the morning. A hand reaching for another one without thinking. The particular comfort of knowing someone had already seen you at your worst and stayed anyway. Looking back now, I understand that the heater breaking wasn't bad luck. It was permission. 20 years of careful distance dissolved because the world got cold enough to force us to stop pretending. Rachel says she'd known for a decade and was just waiting for me to catch up. I believe her. I was always the slower one, more comfortable with old furniture than old feelings, better at fixing what was broken in wood than in myself. We went back to that cabin in the spring, once the roads cleared. Different lake, same water, no snowstorm this time. The heater worked fine. We still slept in one bed anyway. Some habits, once you let yourself have them, you don't want to give back. If two people who knew each other for 20 years could still surprise each other like that, still find something waiting under all that friendship, then maybe there's a version of this story sitting quietly in your own life too, waiting for its own broken heater.